Hi, this is Chris with Priasoft. I wanted to give you a quick demonstration of our Mailbox Migration Manager component of the Priasoft Migration Suite for Exchange. Today what we're going to do is we're going to demonstrate a cross-forest migration from Exchange 2003 to Exchange 2010. What we're going to do here is we're actually going to start in the Outlook client. I'm going to show you some features of the client, talk about some things that we do uniquely with the data within that client to make sure that the end users have a complete, transparent migration experience. So obviously you can see there's some mail in here. All mail will come over. Red on red status is maintained. There are some things though in the background that I want to point out. Now in this case, I've put this user in an out of office state, so you can see that OOF is currently enabled. That has persisted during the migration. One of the other things we deal with is rules. Now if you look here, there's a pretty simple rule in here. It basically says anything sent only to me, move it to the rules folder. Now if I click on this link here, you'll see that it's actually pointing to a subfolder of the inbox which I created as a target of this particular rule. Now, the interesting thing about rules, and there's other items in Exchange you have to be concerned with, the interesting thing about rules is that you can't just simply take a rule from one mailbox and copy it to another and expect it to work. If the rule is simple enough, it may work, but generically speaking, rules weren't really designed by Microsoft to be that portable. So whatever mailbox they're tied to, that's really where they need to be, and moving them to another mailbox is obviously a little bit tricky. Now, the big issue here with rules is not so much the structure of the rule, but it's really when it points to other objects within the current mailbox context. So essentially, if we just took this rule, moved it to the new mailbox, even though that new mailbox on the target would have a folder called rules, the interesting thing about the rules is that obviously they're not pointing at that folder by name, by its path in the hierarchy. They're pointing at it but by what's referred to as a MAPI entry identifier. Think of that like a unique GUID. Okay, so every folder and every store has a unique identifier that identifies it from any other folder. So what the rule is actually storing is the identifier of the folder that it needs to target that message to when the rule actually fires. Okay, so sort of long story short, when we just copy these rules over, we can't just simply do them as is. We have to actually crack them apart and fix those underlying entry identifiers so that they point at the correct object in the target. Therefore, the rule continues to work. So even though we do migrate rules, we're actually fixing them up as we move them across so that at the end of the day, the rule will still fire as it is expected, and the end user won't have to be bothered with recreating all the rules. Okay. Now, there's a lot of areas where this particular problem occurs. But one of the key areas I'll point out, and I'm not going to go too far down in the weeds on how many items refer to others. I think you can get the message. But where this really becomes a problem is in the calendar. Now you can see here we have a sample appointment. Demo user 1 invited user 2, 3, 4, and 5 to the appointment. Pretty standard stuff. If we go into the scheduling tab though, and we take a look here, and if I hover over demo user 1, you can see that he's listed as the organizer. Okay, which basically means obviously he created it, he can therefore change it, manipulate it any way he wants, delete it, etc. Now, if again, same kind of thing, if we just simply took this item as is and copied it into a new mailbox, the owner of the appointment is essentially the source mailbox in that case. So you can't just simply PST them out, PST them in. You actually have to copy them and fix them up so that they actually behave the way they were expected to in the beginning. So what we do is we actually clone the data from the source mailbox into the target. And when we find items like appointments or other items that refer to other MAPI, entry identifiers or address book identifiers, we have to actually fix them up. So in this case, if we took this appointment, we would actually switch the originator in the target to be the target mailbox. So at the end of the day, the user can manipulate the appointments. They won't have to delete and recreate their appointments, which is obviously one of the benefits of using a tool like ours. We're down at the lowest levels of MAPI fixing these items up. So at the end of the day, the experience to the end user is as clean as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and get out of this client. I'm going to go ahead and migrate it over to Exchange 2010 so we can kind of revisit this client when it's attached to Exchange 2010. So we'll sort of get that gist of what did it look like at the beginning, what do we need to do to affect the migration, and then essentially at the end, what does the end user's experience of this process look like. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and exit this client. No, we don't want that. And then I'm going to go ahead and launch the Mailbox Migration Manager wizard. Now, essentially, this wizard allows us to build a batch. And essentially, a batch is a configuration wrapped around a grouping of objects. Okay, so it could be all objects, could be a subset. It really depends on the project and its requirements. But we'll walk through some of the options so you can understand how to build a batch. Now, on the welcome screen, the most interesting thing about this screen is the ability to templatize your configuration. So during a series of dry runs, which I'll talk about, and during piloting and other testing, you're going to come up with what's the right config or configs that we need to run these objects through to get the desired result on the other side. Okay, so once we come up with that config, we can persist that out, and that way when we go into production, we're getting the exact same run or throughput that we were getting when we did it in test, right? So nobody forgot to enable or disable a feature that was required to get the desired result. So I don't have one for this particular run, but I will show you how to create one in a second. So we'll go ahead and collapse that. I'll go ahead and say move next. So on this next screen, essentially what it's asking us is what are our source and target exchange versions that we're migrating between. Okay, so we can drop this down and we can source out of anything from 5.5 all the way up to 2010. Okay, and today I'm going to source out of 2003. And then I can target anything from Exchange 2000 all the way up to Office 365. Okay, today I'm actually targeting 10. Now any combination for the most part that you can create here is all supported, okay, including going backwards. One of the other things you can do is you can also, this would be considered a cross-forest move from 3 to 10. We can also check this box up here, which basically tells the application that we are moving within the same Exchange organization just between versions. Okay, so for instance, if we had 2003 in coexistent mode with 2007, we could use the application to move mailboxes from one version to the next within the same org. In this case, we're going cross-forest. Okay. Down here at the bottom is a unique feature to our tooling, which we call dry run mode. And essentially what that allows us to do is simulate the migration before we do it in production. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, there's a couple of key reasons. One is if we can move all of the data and touch all of the data in a simulated way without affecting the source user during this operation, then we're really going to get two key things out of that. One is going to be, is it going to work? Is there anything in the network or in the environment or configuration-wise that's causing the migration to not succeed or not run as fast as we would like? And number two, we're going to get exact timings of how long this operation is going to take, right? Because that's going to be key, because we're going to have ancillary things that we need to do, switching MX records or dealing with end users or whatever the case may be, communicating to the business. We don't want to guess. We don't want to tell them, well, I think it'll take 12 hours, but we don't really know. That's not where you want to be. Where you want to be is we know exactly that it's going to take 12 hours, exactly. And we know that it's going to succeed because we've already done it once before, right? And if you do find issues during the dry run, that's the time you want to find issues, right? Is when you're not under any pressure, the end users aren't actually moving. We can go in and then make tweaks to the environment to correct or remediate whatever it is that's causing the migration to not be successful, rerun a dry run, and once we're successful with that, we can then run into production. So the goal here is to basically arm you with all of the answers to the test ahead of time and give you that guarantee that it's going to work because you've already done it once or twice. Now, the interesting thing about our licensing model is it is per mailbox and it is a consumable. So once that mailbox is transitioned from source to its target, that mailbox license is consumed. Okay, but you can dry run as many times as you want using your current licenses, and the only time they'll get consumed is when you run the application in production mode, which is actually what I'm going to do right now. Okay, so dry run is a very key feature, and I would highly suggest not ever doing a migration without testing it and specifically dry running it first. Okay, so we'll go ahead and move next. So on this screen, it's asking us, I need some information about the source. Okay, in this case, it's 2003. I need to give it a domain controller in that environment and some credentials to connect. Now, what the tool is going to do with that is it's going to run out and do some discovery. What version of AD is running there? What operating mode is it in? What versions of Exchange happen to be there? What operating modes are they in? Service pack levels, all that sort of data we're going to query automatically. And we're also going to use a lot of that data throughout the wizard to make the experience easier for you to select objects, for migration, etc. So in this case, I can go ahead and type that value in, but we also have a proprietary credential cache that's built into our applications. Now, all of our applications share this credential cache, and the reason it really exists is so that, let's say that I wanted to put in a service account that has elevated rights to the environment, but I did not want to expose that to a lower tier admin who's actually going to be pushing the buttons, if you will. So what I can do is I can store those credentials in this proprietary cache. Now that admin can use them for migration activities, but he cannot use them to do anything else in the environment, right? He can't run ADUC, can't do anything outside of the tooling and what the tooling was designed to do. So you can go ahead and persist those in here. That lower tier administrator can then use those to push buttons without you having to actually expose the password. Now in my case, I have a bunch of credentials stored in here. I'm going to use it just out of convenience. So I have a pair of credentials stored for this source environment. So I'm going to go ahead and use those and say next. Tool's going to run out and do some discovery. And when it's done with that, we get a target domain controller and credential screen. So essentially it's the reverse now. Now tell us about the target domain and the target AD. as well as the target exchange, we'll go query that automatically. Again, though, you just need to give us an endpoint to connect to. So again, I'm going to run back to my cache because I actually have one stored. So I'm going to give it the credentials for Exchange 2010 in this case. The tool again is going to run out and do some discovery. And when it's finished with that, it's going to prompt us with this. And essentially what this is telling us is, hey, these are the Exchange servers that we discovered in the target environment. And because they're all in a green state, it means we found no issues with them, right? So if there was a problem with one of the machines that we discovered, either it's the wrong version or it's running an incomplete service pack, or it doesn't have the correct roll-up on it, and we detect that, we're going to go ahead and tell you about that now so you can go ahead and remediate that before you get too far down the line. Okay. So in my case, all the machines that I intend to be using during this migration are all green. There are no issues, so I can just simply say continue here. Now, on this next screen, it wants to know, are we going to do a one-time migration, meaning we are not going to coexist the environment, or are we going to do a coexisted-based migration? Okay, we support both of those, and really the determination to coexist or not to coexist should really be based on the metrics that we pull back from doing our dry runs. So once we've dry run the environment and we know exactly how long it's going to take, then we can start to make decisions whether or not it's in our best interest to coexist these, or whether we can actually pull off a one-time migration. Now, I can tell you that it's not so much the number of mailbox items or number of mailboxes that we need to migrate that sort of dictates coexisting or not. It's really the total duration and the amount of time that we have with the business to actually create this migration window. Okay, so once we have those dry run metrics back, we can then use those to then make decisions as to whether we should coexist or not. Now, we recently did a large hotel chain, just as an example. They had about 10,000 users. It was roughly 9,800, somewhere in that neighborhood. And were able to do a one-time migration without having to coexist. And we were able to do that over a weekend. And one of the ways we were able to do that was with another unique feature that we have in our application, which is called backfill, which I'll explain in a moment. So there are scenarios where you can do 9,000, 10,000 users over a weekend, and it's totally feasible. One, because we've dry run it, we know how long it's going to take. We then know, from a scheduling perspective, what we need to communicate to the business. And then using the backfill technology that we have, we're able to actually physically do it, right? Because, at a certain point, it becomes too much data or too many items to get done in any particular amount of time. And using backfill, we can shorten that time window, and I'll explain that in a little bit more detail in a second. Okay. So for this particular run, I'm going to go ahead and leave it at one time, but we can also put it in a coexistence mode, in which case the tool will actually go back, protect the source object post-migration so that we have a rollback position. That's one of the key things about using our tooling, is that there's always a way to roll back. We never damage the source environment. We never damage the source mailbox. No data is ever removed or deleted or any other sort of move operation on that. Essentially what we're doing is we're cloning the source object to the target, and once we're done with that and that was successful, we go back to the source, we manipulate it so that it can exist there from an administrative perspective, meaning that admins can get onto it, our tooling can roll back to it if need be, we can backfill from it if that's an operation that we're doing, but the end user is restricted now from getting onto their source account because their new endpoint is now in Exchange 2010 in this case. So what we don't want to happen is, if we've cut the user over, their mailbox is now live on the new target environment, we don't want them inadvertently or accidentally connecting back to the source and creating changes that we then have to persist forward. Okay, so we're going to put that mailbox in a dormant state, is how we refer to it. We can roll back. We actually have a tool that will undo all those changes automatically in the event that we needed to roll back for some reason. But at the end of the day, the mailbox will be sitting in a dormant state, and its properties will be slightly manipulated so that it does not interfere with any production level items that are also in the environment. And then what the tool will do is it'll then drop a placeholder object in place of that object to take any replies or any new mail coming into the source and relay that over to the new object into the target. All right, so we'll go ahead and move next from here. So on this screen, we need to select which objects we intend to migrate. Okay, there's a number of ways to get objects into this view. The simplest way is to browse, which is what I'm going to do. The next way is to use an import file. So if you had a CSV file that had the list of objects that you're interested in, you could certainly feed that to the application. And then we also have a proprietary file that we call a recipient package, and I'll show you how to create one of those. But essentially what that allows me to do is do all of this selection that I'm about to do now, get into the matching operations, who's matched from source to target, what databases are they going to be assigned to, and then I can save that information into a file, and then I can use this load selections button to bring it back into the UI. And the intention there is that I can separate the administration of who's going and where are they going from the actual execution of the batch itself. Okay, so I'll show you how to create one of those, but the easiest way is to simply browse. And what we've done is we've written our own proprietary AD browser tool. And essentially what this is doing is allowing us to do quite a few unique things within AD to find the objects that we're interested in. Now, obviously one way to do it, you can see we see nothing in this view because we're focused at the root. Now, if I were to drop this down, you can basically see that I could go into this OU, and here are the 5 objects that I'm interested in. Okay, so that's one way to do it, is to browse by OU. The other way to do it is if you're back up at the root, you can say show me all objects from all subcontainers, and essentially what it'll do is it'll flatten out the entire domain and show you everything regardless of its OU hierarchy in one flattened list, and you can pick from that. The other thing you can do is you can write LDAP filters. You can say show me all objects where this value contains this or equals that, and it'll show you those objects. You can also treat distribution groups as if they were containers. So if there was a DL that contained the members that we were interested in and we wanted to just simply pick from that membership, we can do that as well. Okay. So in this case, I have them all sort of in the view. I'm going to go ahead and filter these down. The objects I'm interested in start with demo. So I'm just going to go filter on the word demo, and it'll bring up those objects, and they're pretty easy to select. So I can grab one or more and hit OK. Now these objects are brought back into the main selection. Now I can go out and browse more. I can use an import file. I can combine as many ways as I want until this list is fully populated with everyone that I want to execute against in this particular batch. Now we also have a feature in here where I can go and grab one or more objects. In this case, I'll grab user 1 and 2, and then I'm going to say toggle VIP. Now what that basically does is it flags the application to understand that these 2 objects are higher value than the other, or give them higher priority in the processing of the overall batch itself, right? So we may have a CFO, CIO, CEO type of scenario, or may have high valued salespeople that are key to the business. They need to get their data first before everyone else. We can tell the application that these objects are important to us and we need them to have a higher priority over everyone else. Okay, so we'll go ahead and leave those on. And I'm not going to run all these reports, but there are reports on almost all of these screens. So if you wanted to get this data out into a report format, whether it be PDF, Excel, etc., you can use that reporting feature to get that information out of the application. Okay, so go ahead and move next. So now we get onto the target matching screen, and what this is saying is we know what objects we want to migrate from the source. What we need to know now is who do they line up to in the target. Now the objects can already exist, or we can actually create them on the fly. And there's another tool which we're not talking about in this particular demonstration, which is called the collaboration suite, which we can we'll have another video on that soon. But what that will basically do is allow you to pre-stage the environment. So grab all the objects from the source, populate them in the target, grab all the DLs, populate them in the target, grab any contacts that we want, populate them in the target, right? So before we get to this screen, all of the objects are already present in the target in the correct state. Tool will automatically match up to those because we've already done that work of creating a one-to-one relationship. Okay, so the way we would do this is we would essentially do a scan. No matter how the object got here, we want to do a scan. So we're going to do auto match. What that's going to do is for every object in this list that's in an unmatched state, we're going to go out to the target active directory and we're going to attempt to find someone that matches it. Okay. Now we're not doing what we would call a soft match. We're not saying, well, if the display name is similar, we're not going to take those because those are very unreliable matches. We're looking for hard things like, does the SAM account name match? Does the SMTP addresses match? Does the mail nickname match? Right. Key values that we know that if those things are the same, that most likely those 2 objects are related. Okay. Now there is a way for us to go in here if you wanted to contact support to actually change the matching algorithm, because there are cases where you may have created your objects in the target and you've gone through a complete renaming process, right? So nothing about the 2 objects are relatable except for some custom property that you may have assigned. Maybe it's a custom attribute, maybe it's some other value, an employee ID field or something like that. You can actually go in with our assistance and we can show you how to override the matching algorithm to actually match on those attributes instead of the default attributes that we match on. So regardless of your scenario, we're going to be able to help you get through this matching piece. Okay. So in this case, you can see nobody matched. That was intentional. So I can show you, what do we do when these things don't match? So we really have a couple of options, and it depends on why it didn't match. Okay. Now in this case, these users absolutely do not exist in the target. I know that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to create them on the fly. So I'm going to grab one or more, in this case all, and I'm going to say create. It's going to ask me in what OU in the target do you want to create these objects. Okay. So I'll pick the appropriate OU. Hit OK. Tool's going to run out build accounts for these objects, and you'll notice when it's done, they have all moved on to this matched tab. Okay, so essentially what we're doing is we're breaking the results. These are the people who are currently in a matched state, and of course these are the people who are in an unmatched state that still need to be dealt with. Okay, now once you get onto the match tab, again, there's reports that you can run if you want to, but you can also scroll over here to the side and we can see what object did it actually match up to. Now in the case of what we've just done, we've just created it, so we know that the match is correct because it was all created and matched at the same time. Now if we happen to do an auto scan and match up to an object, this is where we want to pay a little bit more attention to make sure that the objects are correctly matched. And if they're not, then what we can do is actually go in here and select one or more objects, and we can say unmatched select. What that does is it puts it back into an unmatched state, and then we have more options for dealing with it. Okay, so in the case of an incorrect match, I could simply go in here and maybe create a new account for it. But there are cases where the object does exist and I just want to force that to occur on my own. So I could grab this object, I could say browse for match, I could look around in the target Active Directory and say this user specifically matches with that user. Okay, and then that'll create what we call a manual match underneath. Okay, so depending on how the state is when you get to the screen would sort of dictate how many of these features you would actually need. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to auto match this guy back up to the account that we just created so that we can have them all in a matched state. Now in order to move from this screen, they either all need to be matched or the objects that are currently in an unmatched state need to be removed from the batch so that we can continue. Kind of makes sense. Okay, so we'll go ahead and move next here. On this next screen it's asking us, okay, out of the objects that we're going to be migrating to the target, what mailbox or store assignments do we actually want to give these users? Okay, now if you pay attention here to this state property, it can be really one of three states. Unassigned means the current target user that we've matched to does not have a mailbox. Makes sense, we just created it, so it would be sort of impossible for it to have a mailbox at this point. So it's in an unassigned state, meaning that we need to put it into an assigned state, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. The other state it can be in is what we call a state of merge, which means that the mailbox or the user that we matched up to already has a mailbox in the target environment, and therefore the default behavior of the application would be to simply take the data from the source and merge it into the existing target. But what you can do with a merge, like you might come in here and you might find, hey, why does demo user 5 show as merge? I don't expect that, I don't trust that. What you can do is you can then tell the application to reprovision that mailbox, which basically underlying what that says is disassociate the current mailbox, don't delete it, just disassociate it, and then gen up a new one and copy the data from the source into the target. So those are the various states they can be in. Okay, but what I'm going to do here is there's really a couple ways I can assign these, and it depends if I want to get super granular about it or not. What you can do is you can grab all 5 users. I can go set target store. That allows me to actually browse out, see the individual stores that are available, and then assign users to them. So I could do users 1 and 2 on this store, 3 and 4 on another, and 5 on on a further store. That's one way to do it. That's pretty granular. Some people will do it that way. We also have this feature called automatic mailbox distribution, and what this basically does is it shows us all the databases that are available, and then essentially whichever ones have checkboxes in them, and they're all checked by default. I'm going to take a few of these off. I'm going to go and sort these by home server. So I'm going to go ahead and uncheck these 2, and then I have these 3 databases now checked. What it's going to do is it's basically going to load these users across those 3 databases. Or if we had all 5 checked, it would essentially load balance them across all 5. So it's a very quick way to load the users out across a specific database range. Okay. Actually, this one's a little low on free space, so I'm going to take that one off as well, and we're just going to say OK here. Now those users have been sort of round robined, if you will, or dealt, if you want to think of it like dealing cards. They've been dealt around to those various databases. Now you can go in here and change these again if you don't like them. So it's totally up to you. These are all soft assignments at this point, so you can go in and do whatever you want until you get this list populated the way you expect it to be. And of course, again, report buttons to get all this data out, share it with team members, etc. Now one of the things, again, if we remember from a few screens back when we were selecting objects, there was a load selections. Here is your save selections button, and this is essentially where we can do all of this work of selecting the 5 users, matching them up to the correct objects in the target, assigning them database assignments. Now I can save this out, and let's say that I was actually planning to do the migration tomorrow. I can then load that data back in, so I can kind of separate this administration from the actual execution of the batch. Okay, so go ahead and move next. So at this point forward, it's all options, so I'll cover most of these. I won't go into too much detail on some of them. Some are self-explanatory. First one is folders and data. Kind of makes sense. If you uncheck that, obviously you will get an empty mailbox, but we will do all the other behaviors that we're configured to do. Generally speaking, most people wouldn't use that, but there are specific scenarios where some of our partners need that. They want to do a net new, but they want to capture, associated content or delegates or other rights that are specific to the object, but they're going to give them what they call net new or dial tone only type of a mailbox. Okay. Next one talks about associated content, and again, the options that you see enabled now are all defaults. So unless you want to deviate from the default, you would just go ahead and accept those, but obviously I'll explain these. So next one talks about associated content, rules, views, out-of-office actions, RSS feeds, all the things that the user can do in the Outlook client. We get to decide as a category whether we want to bring those things over or leave them behind. Okay. Again, it's on by default. Next one is folder delegates. One user is a delegate of another. Now in our case, demo user 1 actually is in a delegate relationship with users 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so that means that 2, 3, 4, and 5 have rights to user 1's mailbox, and I'll show you that when we get to the end of the demonstration. Okay, so by having this checkbox checked, you're basically saying we want to migrate and translate those delegates, so at the end of the day, the delegates remain intact and they actually work the way you expect them to. Now, one of the cool things about this feature is, there's sort of a technical limitation. One of them would be that we cannot restore a delegate if that delegate does not exist yet. All right, kind of makes sense. So what the tool's doing here, let's say in this particular batch, we were not moving all 5 users, we were moving just users 1 and 2. Okay, so what would happen is user 2 would get restored immediately because he now exists in the target onto user 1. But we're also looking at user 1 and we're saying, well, he has unresolved delegates is the way we refer to it. Okay, so what we do is we put a marker on user 1 and we say we need to revisit him on a subsequent batch. Okay, so let's say that tomorrow we then create another batch, and in that batch we bring over 3, 4, and 5. So what's going to happen? 3, 4, and 5 get migrated as expected. We go back and revisit user 1 and restore 3, 4, and 5 automatically on the object. So you don't have to worry so much about breaking users apart accidentally, right? But generally speaking, you want to take logical groupings of people that are most likely going to be related and move them in one operation. Okay, but if somehow inadvertently you do end up breaking a delegate relationship, you take the manager first and the secretary comes later, we'll automatically restore those relationships when that user eventually does migrate. So all that's being tracked in the background. You don't have to worry about that, but I did want to point that out because it is kind of a unique feature. Next one is whether we want to do send on behalf of rights. Same kind of behavior. We can't restore it if the user doesn't yet exist. Same thing happens here. If it can be restored, it is, or it's restored at a further point down the line when that user actually does show up. Now down here I was talking about our backfill process and one of the ways that large hotel chain was able to move roughly 10,000 objects in a weekend, and they were able to do it using backfill. So let me explain how this works. So what I can do is I can turn this on and I can say don't migrate more than the last 45 days of the user's most recent email. Okay, so what that's really going to do is it's going to create a new mailbox. It's going to have a complete calendar, complete task list, complete contacts, journal, notes, etc. Because those things don't make any sense to filter on date range, and those generally are things that the user is going to need on day 1. Okay, but what we're saying here is beyond those types of item classes, only the last 45 days of their most recent mail will be present when they go live on the target. Okay, so that way we can take a very, very large mailbox or groups of mailboxes, cut them down significantly so that the user-facing side of the migration happens very quickly, right? So we're not really moving the entire mailbox, but we're moving just enough to get that user live. They can start sending and receiving and doing their normal behaviors, and then we will enable this feature down here which says we do want to do a 2-stage migration and we want to backfill this object. So what that means is once the user's live with his last 45 and complete calendar, etc., the tool will come back behind that user-facing migration and backfill that mailbox with the remaining data. Okay. Now the cool thing about this is that you can also dry run these scenarios because you might get into a scenario where the business says, yeah, I like that. That's a really, really good feature. But how long is it going to take to do 45 days for everyone? And the question is, well, we don't know, right? It's impossible to tell. 45 days may be 99% of my entire mailbox, where 45 days for someone else may only be 1/10 of their mailbox, for instance. Okay, so really the way you want to do this is you want to dry run these scenarios so that you can get the exact timings. The first timing would be what is the user-facing side going to take, and then the second would be how long does it take to finally backfill all of the data. Once you have those 2 answers, you can then go and shop this to the business and with confidence, knowing that exactly we're going to get our first phase done in 8 hours, and then the remaining phase will happen over the next 12 or 16 hours, just depending on how many items we're dealing with and how much data we're talking about and how many mailboxes, for instance. Okay, but this is one way, and one really, really special way that you can get in and get things done very quickly. so that you can get that user-facing side of the migration done as quickly as possible. So that sort of perceived window of time that the user feels like they're waiting, we can get that shortened down quite a bit so that they can get on their new mailbox quickly, and then we can just simply backfill that data as we see fit. Okay, so that's how we would turn that on. I'm going to go ahead and disable this for now. The other thing we have down here, this is a little bit more of a black belt option, but what this is really saying is if there are specific item classes that you have that you do not want to migrate. For instance, you might have an archive system that's placing stub messages in the source. Now, obviously, if we were to copy those stub messages to the target, they're probably not going to work, right? So a lot of cases people will go in and say, well, I have these specific message classes that I need to exclude, IPM.Symantec.archive, for instance, right? So we can go in there and say, we don't want these message classes because they're not going to work, and we have another way of dealing with, archiving on the other end, okay? Either way, you can go in and configure that. By default, we're going to pick up all the standard message classes, but you can go in and filter out non-standard message classes if you need to, okay? So we'll go ahead and say next here. So on this screen, this first option here talks about should we migrate display attributes from the source to the target. These are talking about address, city, state, zip, department, office, phone, fax, etc. We get to decide whether or not we want to bring those over. Okay, I'll leave that up to you guys. The next one talks about what locale are those mailboxes in. So for instance, if we were doing a migration in Germany, we would obviously want to make sure that those mailboxes remain in German, and at the end of the day, a German mailbox doesn't turn into an English-based mailbox, right? Would be not successful. So you can go in here and specify the user culture of the mailbox, and we'll persist that mailbox in that language. Okay. Now in this case, the default is English. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to specify anything because the default is English. That's what I'm doing today, so I don't have to be concerned with this. But obviously, if I was running in another country or I was running against a set of mailboxes that run a different language than English, I would want to go ahead and set that. Okay. Now in the mailbox settings, there's a whole bunch of these. I'll just kind of cover the first ones that we can see visible, and I'll allow you guys to peruse through here as you see fit. But really, what this is saying is there's really a couple of states that these types of settings can be in: sending message size limit, receiving size limit, recipient limits, storage limits, those types of things. We can say either copy from source, which means if the user has a specific limit set, go ahead and get that and persist that to his new object. Excuse me. The next one says use the Exchange default, which is the default behavior, which says, don't bring any settings from the source. Just go ahead and inherit from the settings that the user is going into. Okay. And the next one says I want to force a value across the board. Okay. And again, these are batch level settings, so they apply to everyone in the batch. So if I did that and I said set everybody's sending message size limit to a specific kilobyte range, then everybody in this batch is going to be set that way, right? Okay. So that's kind of how these work. There's a whole bunch down here. I'm not going to go through those just in the interest of time, but you have full granular control over all of those features, including whether the user has MAPI access, whether they have Outlook web access, and all the other things you can turn on and off or persist from source to target. Just depends on what the scenario is. All right, so on this screen, again, more options. I'm going to try to move through these as quick as I can in the interest of time. So this first one says move full access permissions from the source to the target. Okay. Now these are different than delegates. We've already talked about those. Those are where the user goes into their mailbox client and they actually say, I want to grant this user permission to this folder, etc. These permissions are actually stored on the AD user itself, right? So I would go in. These are usually on shared mailboxes, is where you see this mostly. But on a shared mailbox, I might go in and say, well, this NT user has full mailbox access, and so does this one, etc., etc. Same kind of thing with send as, which is the next one down. Okay. The key thing to understand here is when you say you want to do this, is there's usually, when you look at a permission list, there's a list of permissions that are being inherited down from a parent, and then there's a list of explicit objects that are on that. So what we do is we filter out the inherited permissions, right? And we just get the explicit objects that are assigned on that, and those are the ones that we're actually going to bring across. Okay. You have an option here to disable a source Windows account post-migration. Some scenarios that make sense, others it doesn't. Just kind of depends on the project. Features there. Down here, though, is where we can actually say what type of mailbox object do we want provisioned on the target. So the way this would work is if we're running normal mailboxes through the process like we are now, we would leave it set at normal. If we were running a set of shared mailboxes through, then we would want to batch them separately and go in here and set this so that the appropriate mailbox type is created at runtime, and we don't have to go back and deal with taking a user mailbox which is really shared and converting it later, right? It allows you to go ahead and specify those things at a batch level. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that on normal. Mailbox ownership rights. The tool has several capabilities. One is, and it depends on the project, is to create what we call linked mailboxes, and it depends on the version of Exchange, the terminology that you would use, but it could be associated external in older versions of Exchange, could be linked in newer versions of Exchange, but essentially it means somewhat the same thing. It means that the mailbox will exist in the new forest, but the permission to it will be granted to the user in the source. So we could basically remove Exchange and move it to the new environment, leave the user logging onto their current Active Directory domain, but give them access to their new mailbox without them being prompted in any way for passwords. Okay, and then it gets a little bit more granular as you move down to deal with very specific scenarios where you currently are in a resource forest model, meaning that the current Exchange implementation, the users are permissioned by a domain, one domain back. Okay. Now, if we wanted to move them and still have them in a linked relationship, we would not want to go back to the current, user that's holding the mailbox. We'd want to go one domain back and get that user and apply it to the new target object. So it can get a little bit complicated, but it just depends on the scenario. But again, the tool has all of those capabilities. Now, on the scripting side, you have the ability to implement your own custom scripts. You can do those as a pre-batch script, which means do it before anybody goes. You can also do it on a per mailbox, either at the beginning of the migration of that mailbox or at the end, or in all three positions, kind of depends. Okay. Now, on the two scripts that are pre and post, we have relationships with the directories on both sides, and we have replaceable tokens that you can go in and say, well, call my script, but I need the legacy Exchange DN of the source object, or I need the mail alias of the target. Whatever it is, you put those tokens in, and what we'll do is we'll replace those with actual values from the directory when we call your script. Okay. On the Performance tab, this is where we tell the application how many mailboxes we want to migrate concurrently at any one point in time. Okay. Now, this can actually be pushed up and pushed down on the fly. It's sort of up to us, what we want to do. Now, generally speaking, the way you figure this out is you actually do this during dry run. So while you're dry running, there's going to be a certain level of concurrency that you're going to reach, and exceeding that level is only going to slow down the entire batch, right? Because either the source I/O can't keep up, target can't keep up, or something with the network can't keep up, right? So we have a document that talks about when you're dry running, what you want to actually pay attention to, and what those metrics should be, so that you can figure out exactly what the correct concurrency is. Okay. Dry run options. If we were in dry run, which we are not, we have some ability to manipulate how those objects are going to be created. Next one is on SharePoint integration. So we have this feature where we can actually integrate with SharePoint, and we can take migration statistics and metrics and push those up into a SharePoint list. So you tell us what site you want us to mount to, we'll create a list or adopt a list that's already there, adjust its schema, and then we will start pumping migration statistics into that SharePoint site. And the reason that would be is there may be other project stakeholders out there that want to know what's going on. They want to have some awareness of who's migrated, how long did it take, right? Some of that type of data. And instead of them bothering the person actually doing or affecting the migration, that data can be pumped up to SharePoint, and we can direct those key stakeholders up there, and they can fetch the information that they're interested in from there. Okay, help desk, etc. Right? As you could probably figure out the various reasons that you would want to do that. All right, on notification settings, we have the ability to have the application send us on a schedule a message, and that message will contain exactly where it's at. The tool is designed to run headless or lights out, if you will, meaning nobody needs to sit there and babysit it. Okay, so what we may want to do is take off and go do something else, or we may want to go grab something to eat, but we want to keep track of what's actually happening without having to sit there and sort of look at it, if you will. Okay, so what we're actually going to do is the tool will send you a message every 15 minutes by default, so that you can keep track of the migration. And then we have some scheduling features, which I'm not going to get into in the interest of time. Okay, so we'll go ahead and say next. All right, so now we're on the client profile screen. On this screen, essentially what it's asking us is, do we want to use our PreSoft Profile Manager application to update Outlook clients after the migration has been completed? So we have a tooling that will actually reach out to the end user desktops and redirect their Outlook client. I'll actually show you that in a little bit, how it's actually deployed. Right now, what I need to do is I need to specify the location that where I'm actually hosting that in. So I'm going to go ahead and do a browse here. And then I'm going to run out to a domain controller. I'm going to look at the net logon share, and then under Profile Manager is where I'm actually hosting this application. So you can see here it's on a DC in the net logon share in a directory we created called Profile Manager. Okay, so I'll get to that later when we actually go and do the Outlook client update. But just remember here that I'm associating this batch with this deployed location. And then here we can override CAS server settings or send them to CAS arrays as necessary. Down here we can also save our migration settings. So if you remember in the very beginning, we had the ability to load settings in. This is where we would actually persist them out. So if you wanted to go ahead and persist these settings, you can do that, and then on subsequent runs, you can make sure that all runs go through the process exactly the same way. Okay, so I'll skip over that for now. Go ahead and say next. So in this screen, we're basically validating what we intend to do. So it's sort of a review screen. We're doing cross-forest, Exchange 2003, Exchange 2010, 5 users of the batch. We are using Profile Manager, etc. So when I click next, what the tool is actually going to do here, before it actually starts up the batch itself, is what it's going to do is going to run out and test all the endpoints. So what we want to make sure is that for every user that we selected and every database that's going to be involved in this particular operation, that we actually have an endpoint that we can talk to, and more importantly, that we can actually access that endpoint to do the work that we actually need to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to run through all those various combinations to make sure that we can connect where we need to connect. If that succeeds, then we'll go ahead and launch the batch. If it doesn't, we'll stop right there. We'll tell you what servers we're having connectivity problems to. You can go restore that, retest. Once the test succeeds, it'll go ahead and move forward. The main purpose of that is, one, we want to know early on if there's any databases that are offline or down or endpoints that can't be reached, network problems, etc. We want to filter all that out now before we walk away from the console. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and say next. It's going to run some tests. We'll wait for those to succeed. All right, so all those tests that have succeeded, the migration wizard will actually go away, and the console will actually come up. So the console is actually where we're going to manage the batch and its operations. Okay, so you can see the users in this list view. This is essentially what we call the queue view. So this is basically telling us in what order will objects go. We can also see objects that are currently in a pending state. We can also sort them by active state. We can see which ones are provisioned, completed, etc. Okay. So I'll go back to the queue view. And then over here on the right-hand side, if you look, there's a pie chart. And this chart will show you the various states that the users are in. So you can kind of at one glance understand, how many are active, how many are in a provision state, how many are pending, how many completed, etc. You can look at that chart. Now, as data starts to move through the process, we're going to see these messages per second indicators and kilobits per second indicators start to show us data. So right now what it's doing is it's actually provisioning the accounts on the 2010 side. Once those accounts become active, you'll see data starts to move across the screen. So you can see here that our messages per second indicator is starting to indicate that there's data moving. So you can see here, this is showing you the current messages per second here on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, it's showing you the high watermark. And then down here, it's actually showing you the average. Okay, and these messages per second are across all 5 of these active objects. So now if I go back onto the View Active tab, we can actually see here what percentage complete the individual items are, what messages per second individually they're getting, and then some other statistics about them. So we'll go ahead and let those finish up. But while you're doing your dry runs, this message per second indicator is very key. That's really the key indicator that tells you how quick is data moving. The faster we can get the messages per second, obviously the faster we can get the users across the line. So while you're dry running, you're going to want to pay attention to that. Now you'll notice here there's an increased concurrency and a decrease. We currently have 10 active if you look down here in the status bar. Now I can obviously push that up, I can push that down on the fly during runtime. So generally speaking, while you're doing a dry run, you're going to want to start with a lower concurrency ratio and then start adding more concurrency slowly in a controlled fashion and monitoring your messages per second. And again, we have a white paper that explains how to do all those things, so you don't need to take notes on that. Down here, we're also monitoring the memory of the host. We're talking about how many megabytes we've migrated, how many messages we've moved through the process. We're also monitoring the latency of the machines involved. So here we've got a couple of domain controllers, as well as we have some Exchange servers in here. So if I break these out, obviously latency is sort of a killer when you look at Exchange migration. So here we can actually track the latency from this host to the domain controller. We can see there's some variance in here, but for the most part, it's under 10 milliseconds, which is decent. So go ahead and move that back down, but you can kind of keep a running track here of what the current millisecond latency is and then what its highest has been. And then if you wanted to see a graph or a chart of those events, you can go ahead and bring up that dialog as well and take a look at that. So we're waiting for this last object to finish up. One thing I want to tell you about this process is that, let's say this user, demo user 1, who's currently active, who's about to complete, let's say he was about 80% through the process and the network dropped out from underneath. Something occurred where we could no longer establish the connections we needed to finish this object. What we would do is we would mark that object as failed. Okay, I'm going to view the completed list here. We would mark that object as failed. You'd be able to open up and look at the verbose log, which I'll do here just to show you what it looks like. We'll open the verbose log, and essentially this log is sectioned in two pieces. At the top, it gives you some statistics about the object that we're dealing with, and then down here is a scrollable pane that actually shows us all of the operations that have been completed. Now, in the case of a failure, what's going to happen here is we'll actually tell you exactly what we were doing, and then we'll try to give you an indication of what actually caused the failure. You can then go and remediate that problem. And then you can actually come back to a failed object and you can right click on it and you can say restart failed mailbox. And essentially what's going to happen is it'll pick up right where it left off. So it was 50% done when the error occurred, if you will. Then we'll just resume from that 50% and continue on. We're not going to dupe any data. We don't have to restart the job. The tool is designed to recover in that way. Subsequently, the batch itself that we're currently operating on, which is complete in this case, is also fault tolerant. So if the box were to go down while this batch was actually executing, we can simply go to a shortcut that we've created for this batch and bring it right back. It'll resume from where it left off. Okay. There's also some reports we can run out of here, but for the most part, the key issues are going to be, obviously monitoring the overall statistics, taking care to watch for the messages per second, kilobits per second, and then make sure that if you do have some latency, if you can increase that or decrease that, that would be obviously beneficial to the migration. So at this point, we're done with this console. If I wanted to export any of this data or grab some reports, I can certainly do that. But I will tell you that in the background, we're automatically storing various report classes that you can consume. So some are, Excel consumable. Others are reports, others are data detail logs. So all of this data is being stored automatically in the background. Of course, you always have the verbose log as well, but there's a number of places that we're storing metrics and data about these objects. So you don't necessarily need to collect it from this UI if you don't want to. But again, these batches are automatically stood up in a batch structure within the start menu. So every time you launch a batch, a start or a shortcut is created to that batch, so you can always get back to it in the case of a redundancy, or if you ever wanted to go back and look at a previous history, you can go back and see the exact details that occurred there. Okay, so we're done with this this tool. I'm going to go ahead and close this out. So the next thing we want to do is we want to update the Outlook client profile. So let me go out to that Profile Manager directory and explain to you how this is working. All right, so again, in this domain controller net logon, we created a directory called Profile Manager, and inside of this directory are several files that make this process work. So the first one is an executable file that actually does the work on the client machine. The second one is a config file, which actually tells the Outlook update process what we want to do, so what behavior should we do. And then there's what we call a control file, which is this third file here, that actually has a list of migrated objects in it. So the way the process works is it'll launch on the client machine, it'll inspect all profiles, not just the default profile, it'll compare those profiles to known good migrated users in the control file. If one of those profiles matches a known good migrated user, that profile is immediately updated to point in the correct endpoint. Okay, so the way this is normally deployed is through a group policy or a login script. Okay, so you would have everyone run this. Every time they log into their desktop, our process would run. Now, let's just say that we weren't migrating until 2 days from now, but we deployed it today. So obviously, people would be logging into the environment. Process would run, sees no migrated objects in the control file, leaves the profiles exactly the way they were. Okay. The next time it's run and the control file entry has been populated automatically by the migrator, that user will automatically be redirected to the new environment. Okay. Behind that is a logs directory. So inside of here are actual detail logs from the stations. And the reason we do this is because we're running on multiple hosts all over the environment, we want to centralize that logging back to one place. So essentially all the machines will log back to this directory. And then there's actually a real-time profile migration monitor that runs on top of this if you wanted to have that summed up into a UI. So if you wanted to see a chart of it, you want to see more specific details about users and workstations and what the process was, you can certainly run that on top, or you can consume the logs directly. It's completely up to you. The cool thing about the monitor, though, is that multiple people can run it simultaneously. So you could have people at the help desk watching it, so they could be more proactive versus reactive, right? So if a client failed to update for some reason, that would be notified to the console. The operator at the console would know to reach out to that end user and dispatch some help for him, or or figure out what's going on with their client profile, get them fixed up, versus waiting for a ticket to open, and then by that time you're more in a reactive state than a proactive state. Okay. Now, this process runs on it needs to run as the user. That's the only requirement. It's a C++ application with no Windows dependencies, so it doesn't depend on anything other than the Outlook substructure. Beyond that, though, it'll run on any Windows operating system. We don't care what service pack. We don't care what version it is. It'll also run on all versions of Outlook except Outlook 64-bit. So if you have 64-bit clients, let us know. We have a process for that. But this process is a 32-bit application, therefore can only update 32-bit clients. Okay. Now the process itself takes about 3 seconds to run. It's very uneventful. It's designed that way on purpose. You'll see me run it. You may or may not see anything because it does run in about 3 seconds when it's making an update, and milliseconds if there's no update to be made. And it does have a UI element by default. It just says, please wait, updating your client. Now you can, through the config, you can tell it don't show any UI at all, or you can rebrand the UI. You can even change the text. And that's specifically important if you're going to run it in another language other than English. You'd want to localize it to that particular language. Okay. So numbers of options about whether it should show itself or not, but it will never interact with the user. It's never going to stop them or ask them any questions. It's just going to get in, do what it needs to do, and report back to you in the back end. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and run it. It's somewhat uneventful, but we'll go ahead and run it. Okay, I saw the dialog. I don't know if you guys saw that or not, but let's go into the logs directory, and we'll see that we have another log. So it basically says this user running on this workstation was updated. Okay, now we can run the monitor on top of this and consume some of the logs, but if you want, I'll just open up one of these logs real quick and just kind of scan through here, and you can see where it's actually enumerating all the profiles, finding the ones that match and updating those, and leaving the ones that do not match in the current state. So at this point, what I want to do is actually run the Outlook client. So let me go ahead and minimize this. We'll go ahead and run the Outlook client. And I have it right now prompting me for a profile. Now, if I had one already default, it would just obviously go straight in, but I do this on purpose so that we can actually stop here. Now, I'm going to drop this down, and you'll notice that we have a demo user 1 backup and a demo user 1. Okay, so what we've done is we've backed up the original client profile that was pointing at 2003 in case we ever needed to roll back. Now that's optional. You don't have to do that, but it's probably recommended. It would give you a nice rollback position. Otherwise, there's other processes to reverse the profile, but this is the simplest, and it's on by default. Obviously, if you can turn it off if you wish. These other profiles in here are all used by our process, so we'll ignore those. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and log into our new profile here. And sort of presto, we're now attached to Exchange 2010. Now you can see from my perspective as an end user, all I did was really launch Outlook. I kind of stopped there to point out a few things, but for the most part, all I did was just launch the client, and now we're attached. Okay. So a couple things I want to show you in here. Let's go back in here. I know I didn't show you this at the beginning, but if we go under here and we go under permissions, you can see that demo user 2, 3, 4, and 5, as we talked about earlier, have all been restored as delegates. Okay. If you remember earlier, we also had out of office enabled, so let's go ahead and launch that. You can see that that is obviously enabled. The user can turn it off when they return from holiday. Let's go into our rules. You can see here our rule is now here. Here's the real test. If we click that, we can see that a rules folder was created as part of our migration process, and then as we moved the rule, again, we went back and actually fixed it up so that it continues to work. Okay. Well, I thank you for your time. If you have any questions, please visit us. Please give us a call or visit us online. Thank you very much.